campfires.
Ready?
Yeah.
All right, so welcome again, everyone. For those of you that just arrived, this is the second work session of the evening, and it is the Mount Crested Butte Master Plan. Hillary.
Thank you, Nicholas, and thank you, Council. So really exciting that we're here today. I feel like we've come quite a way on a journey since we had launched Master Plan 2.0 back in, what was it, May now? So it's been a pretty accelerated process to get to where we have a draft master plan, thanks to the talents of the Norris design teams. I have Elena Scott here with me, and I believe Tori and Matthew are on the call. A big thanks to them in getting this to a point where we had really recalibrated the plan to address the concerns that we're hearing both from the community and town council. So thank you. So I briefly touched on the schedule, but we are in the draft master plan phase with the public comment period closing on September 23rd. And then we will then finalize the master plan with the Norris design team, and then hopefully have adoption of the final plan sometime in December. So first, not everybody is initiated with what a master plan is or does. First, this is something that's required by Colorado state statute. You might hear it be referred to as a comprehensive plan, a compass, whatever it is. It's the policy document that shapes the vision of the community and directs future land use and development. It establishes a community vision, water conservation and other environmental stewardship policies. I think one of the biggest takeaways to remember is that this is a policy document. It is not a regulatory document. It does not create any entitlements. It does not change zoning. It simply outlines a number of recommendations to be considered. We are in the draft phase, which means nothing in here has been adopted at this time and could be subject to change before we get to a final draft. And again, it's that recommendations for implementation. So outlining, how do we get here? How do we implement, how do we get to our vision? How do we get to our goals? So we'll have recommendations in the action plan for each of our respective action plan items. So in order to understand where you want to go, you want to know who you are now. So the consultant team conducted an analysis of where we are right now in terms of housing. Some of the interesting takeaways here is that, let's get some more notes here. Right now, as of 2021, December 2021, the average single family home in Mount CB is $1.26 million. That probably shouldn't come as a surprise to anyone, but real estate values have increasingly escalated, especially since the onset of COVID. And that is juxtaposed with just 77 community housing units within our boundaries. 2 of those have been constructed since 2010, and we have not seen a single community housing unit constructed in Mount CB since then. We have participated with our regional partners in contributing funds to develop housing projects such as Anthracite Place, but we haven't actually constructed anything within our boundaries. And I think that's an important takeaway as we think about what we want and our goals as a community and what we think the most important values are. So with regard to land use, one of the interesting takeaways is that 25% of our land is zoned PUD, which generally indicates that our existing zoning code isn't working. So we should, in moving forward to the implementation of this plan, take a look at what our zoning code says and how can we make it better to address the needs of our community. We also have a disparity in the average household income here versus Gunnison County. It's about, I believe it's about, per household, about 65 in Gunnison County. I apologize, I didn't write that down before we got here, but $109,000 is the average household income in Mount Crested Butte. And this really relates to some of our quality of life issues. While we have unparalleled outdoor access. We certainly have a lack of access to housing resources, and that unavailability has negative impacts to public health. In looking at our existing commercial core and the businesses there, we have about 50,000 square feet of existing commercial floor area, and studies show that we could support about 100,000 square feet. The plan does recommend that we look at about 85,000 square feet. I think one of the important things to note is that this is based on what we have right now. We are currently losing a lot of money to our neighbors every year. You can see here that we have a lot of money, $31.9 million that is spent by our overnight guests, and that isn't all spent in our community. And so if we saw more vitality in our base area, we could see a lot more capture of that expenditure within the North Valley. So another interesting thing is to consider how we've changed over time. We have two master plans that I've referenced here, one in 1994 and the last one, which is our current adopted master plan, which is in 2007. Back in 1994, there was stigma around community housing. The reason for integrating community housing units wasn't because we wanted to see the members of our community living side by side with our part-time residents. It was because it was seen as unattractive. ADUs were not effective community housing inventory in 1994, and they have continued not to be an effective means of community housing in our community. In 2007, one of the really interesting things is that a lot of the recommendations and values are the same today as they were in 2007, and that we want to have a regional approach to our planning issues. That we want to look at horizontal zoning regulations, that we want to have walkable, complete neighborhoods with year-round residential population to help contribute to vitality in our neighborhoods. So how did we get to a vision? Well, it was a lot of talking. So we embarked on a three-pronged approach in Master Plan 2.0 that did pull in information from the initial first draft. Tabling at farmers markets to community surveys where we had nearly 500 responses by the time all was said and done. We had leadership meetings with focus groups with town council and planning commission, DDA, base area owners group, and we also had a public open house and a town picnic. And all of those were distilled down to who we are as a community. So one of the interesting things to see is comparing what happened between phase 1 and phase 2, and honestly not a whole lot beyond the fact that housing became more of a priority and the base area became more of a priority. But in terms of the order of importance or how important they are, it was relatively static. Go ahead.
All right. Hi, Elena Scott for the record. Good to see you all again. This is actually pretty nice that we got to have the Crested Butte compass presentation right before this, just to kind of set the tone for how we're looking at vision and values. Because in master planning and comprehensive planning, that really sets the foundation for future decision making, and it's really important. So the new draft 2.0, I'm not going to read you this vision statement, but it does include a shared community vision, which is the starting place for who we are now and who we want to be. And then the values build upon that. It's defining those qualities that are most important to the community. So not only in the 2021 efforts that we went through with engagement, but also those continued efforts over the past several months, we've seen that these values have maintained consistency: access, community, stewardship, and approachability. We go to the next one. Then we, and Hillary has some really, she skipped ahead a little bit there onto the intersection slide, because that's really important, is how do all of these things come together to help us into the future. So in addition to having those values, we have principles, and those are the key elements that focus our actions towards how we're going to move forward. So the values are who we are and the defining qualities of our community. The principles help us move in towards action, where we have created policies, recommendations, and different identified partners in chapter 3 of the document that really help us to get from who we want to be to really making some impact on the things that matter most to Mount Crested Butte. We dig a little bit deeper.
Thank you, Elena. So I think it's really important to tie this back to all of these action plan or action categories to why we are doing this. And that's why we kind of explained how we got to our community vision, how we got to these shared values, because that helps support the recommendations that are outlined in this plan. So within each action category, you'll see under the gray bubbles, the related principles to a given action category, the related values to a given action category, and then related action categories, because all of this is really, again, all tied together. Land use touches literally everything. And that's the first thing that we're going to dive into. And it's going to be probably the heaviest lift of I believe 7 action categories that we have to discuss this afternoon. Lectern is not large enough. So we'll start off with future land use. So in each of these slides, I've provided a summary of the goals, policies, and recommendations. I won't read all of these to you, just touch on a number of them. And really the importance of the recommendations that are in here is really to add vitality and just vibrancy to our community. On the existing conditions slide, one of the takeaways is that currently our year-round residential population in our residential units is about 30%, which means 70% of our residential units in our community are either second homes or they are STRs. So the future land use map and the future land use goals, policies, and recommendations section outlines the framework for us to help develop more community. We just listened to the town of Crested Butte's presentation. 65% of their residential units are occupied year round, in contrast to our 30%. And that is palpable in both communities. That's what brings your vitality. That's what brings the funk to Crested Butte. And so we want to bring that up here because we also want to be our own community with our own distinct identity. So we'd like to establish a vibrant, active commercial core, and we've developed short and midterm and long-term actions. We want to increase density where it's appropriate to prevent sprawl and promote efficient land use. We'd also like to coordinate with our regional partners to promote regional responsible growth. And this ties into what Troy had expressed earlier. Housing, for example, is a regional issue. So how do we discuss our responsible growth throughout our community? Because it's truly a regional issue. We'd also like to create a sense of place with complete neighborhoods. We want to know our neighbors and potentially have the opportunity for some sort of neighborhood commercial, whether that's a coffee shop or a dog groomers, Carlos's favorite example of neighborhood commercial. So we're gonna go over to the intersectionality slide, and then we're gonna take a little bit of a deeper dive into the future land use map, the categories, and the recommendations there. Jen, did you have your hand raised?
Well, it was just the future land use map. Was that something that was already in existence, or is that something that y'all created as part of this process?
Thank you, Elena. Yes, we have had a future land use map. I'm not sure about the 94 document, but in 2007, Carlos made this map that identified the various land uses that we wanted to see at that time throughout our community. So this is something that is a part of most comprehensive plans. Again, the Compass is kind of an exception to these more traditional types of documents.
Because I was just surprised by the section that was the high density unit that's kind of below the town center part, where, you know, we've got Marcelina Lane that's nothing but, you know, condos and whatever, that wasn't high density, but yet these streets that have a lot of houses on them was high density.
And
So-
we'll delve into that as we get into the future land use map. Let's talk about the intersectionality component, then we can kind of like start to look at the different geographies and the recommended future land uses on throughout our community. So this is really one where land use really drives everything with regard to how it relates to our values, principles, and these action categories. Particularly, so I'm glad that you mentioned the increased density. So the future land use map does indicate that the community should explore upzoning of various areas throughout our community to increase the availability of attainable and affordable housing units. Part of the reason why we've only seen 2 community housing units since 2010 is because we haven't seen much residential multifamily development, which creates inclusionary zoning requirements, which creates those additional units. So this is a bold vision, but we are in a housing crisis, and it is our community's #1 priority to address housing. So the recommendations in here are to create additional density through either medium density residential and then some areas of high density residentials that are indicated on the future land use map. In addition to that, we have the plan recommends considering neighborhood commercial throughout our residential zone districts so that as we have that critical mass of people, you have the availability of creating a small locally serving business within that community that's appropriate in a given context. And again, this isn't creating zoning at this time. It is just, we should be looking at the areas that are most appropriate to create density within our community, to reduce sprawl, to take advantage of our infrastructure, to reduce our water needs, because going back to the 2007 plan, that had recommended additional density, smaller lots, walkable, compact, complete neighborhoods. And so this is really just an extension of the 2007 goals, but we have really drilled down and looked at like, what do we need to do? Like, what are other municipalities throughout the nation doing to address their housing concerns? And this is definitely one of the leading mechanisms. It's not the only thing that will fix our housing problem, but it will definitely help address that. So I feel like I've kind of gone away from the future land use intersectionality slide, but that's all right, because I'd love to dive into the future land use map with you. And I feel like we can just kind of weave all of these elements in.
I think that you did touch on it quite a bit, Hillary, just in the gray circles as an example, responsible growth, multimodal transportation, and housing options. The ability for us to encourage that type of locals housing within our established infrastructure reduces costs, improves walkability, and just overall allows us to help create that more vibrant commercial core. We work in communities all throughout the mountains, and having that type of bolder approach does help to create those more successful commercial businesses in the shorter walking distance to more people.
Thank you for that addition. So, and I would just want to add one more thing to that, is that if you have more people, you generally have more people that can serve your essential businesses, that can increase your transit ridership, which will then in turn increase the frequency, which will make those systems work better. So there's just so many ways in which the future land use map really relates to all of these other action categories, and we'll just continue to kind of weave back and forth throughout this conversation. So here, if I can zoom in on this while
It's printed out on the
it is
wall
printed
over
out
there
over there. I
behind
might need
Dwayne too.
binoculars to read that far away. But so one of the things that so we've received some initial public feedback on the future land use map. And that has been primarily with regard to the pocket of high density residential. And if you don't mind pointing, thank you. The pocket of high density residential that's directly north of the commercial core, located along, I want to call it Whetstone, but that's not right. And Bellevue. And so in that zone right there, it's currently zoned as single family, and we've received some feedback and concerns around increasing the density to that degree in that area. Maybe to Janet's point, it would be more appropriate to be shifted to the western portion of Gothic Road, adjacent to areas like Three Seasons and where we have a lot of those condo uses. So council might consider that we perhaps in the future land use map, change that high density residential to be more consistent with the areas surrounding it. So that's just the more medium density residential. So kind of a gradual incremental upzoning approach that would need to go through a whole additional public process that would be lengthy and exhaustive of just a lot of outreach before it even got to a public hearing process.
Yeah, I was questioning this section
So
of that being high density as opposed to these others that are medium density.
So can you please clarify exactly what either the concern or the change would be? I just can't quite hear you. I'm sorry, Janet.
Single family homes in this area. Yeah. You know, you got up here where it's like, you know, where you've got nothing but condos and stuff like that. Why is that medium density and this high density when you have homes, so many individual homes in it?
I hear what you're saying. And generally speaking, areas that were closer to the commercial core or the base area were indicated to, those are generally areas that you'd want to see density based on kind of that transect model of having your commercial core to higher density residential uses and then transitioning into those lower density uses. So am I hearing that we should be considering that higher density residential use along where those condos are through there?
It's, you know, just like condominium complex after condominium complex.
A lot of that is in those whole areas is pretty much already all developed.
Yeah.
There's very few lots left in there, so, you know, it's almost a moot point, you know, what is designated.
But it just doesn't seem balanced.
Sure, and
when
just
you've
with
got an area that does have a lot of single homes that, you know, it's being classified as high density, where these other places that actually are high density are being classified as medium density.
Sure, and again, that's a future land use designation, so I think they're low density residential, so it still represents an increase. But I hear what you're saying, and we'll take a look into that. I do want to just, Dwayne, I just heard a comment, and I do want to point out that we have seen a lot of change in our community, and there are a lot of aging buildings in our community that will eventually be replaced. So to say that we shouldn't have guidance as to what happens in those areas as they're redeveloped would be allowing development to drive us rather than us driving development. And that is really the purpose of having a policy document like that, is rather than being reactive, that we're being proactive in what we want to see in these areas as our community redevelops, because it will, because we are seeing increased interest from a lot of the real estate community. And we just want to make sure that we drive the bus rather than being a passenger, if you will. Sarah, sorry, I'll get to you after.
So I'm questioning where you've taken what is definitely single family today and designating it potentially as medium density residential. I live in a 40-year-old house that is probably going to at some point be replaced. So if this street that has been traditionally single family and only has single family homes on it, it could be potentially, if all these things fall into place, torn down and a triplex be built there?
We have not gone through a process. Again, this is not an entitlement document, but it is being suggested that we explore where density is more appropriate, and we only have so much land and we don't have housing. And what is causing some of our housing issues is the lack of supply.
Supply of land or supply of houses?
Frankly, both. Hold on, Dwayne, I'm sorry. Michael was ahead of you.
Just because I can't remember, sorry, the difference between medium density and high density, what's the unit count there for something like that?
So we don't have a unit count yet. It's
And what
high
defines
level.
What defines a medium versus a high?
It actually depends on the community, which I realize is a very frustrating answer, but it depends on what the community wants to see. So low density residential could be just duplexes, and medium density could just be up to triplexes. A high density could be up to 8 units. I'm just throwing numbers out here because we haven't actually explored what those should be. That isn't the intent of a master plan, to drill down that deep into what those unit counts would look like.
We have a current definition of that in our code? Don't we?
No, low density and high density.
No medium, okay.
Well, that's why adding in the medium is kind of bridging the gap between, condo and multifamily versus a duplex, a triplex, things of that nature that could potentially get more local home ownership within the neighborhoods.
Roman.
Well, this might be worth taking offline and needling down to how you come up with the averages between the different zones, but objectively, section to the west includes Snowmass Road, not Paradise, where does, where Paradise, and then in the high density, that includes Timberline, Black Bear Lodge, Mountain Edge, the Westwall Lodge, where Alec lives, where Carlos used to live. So maybe it's like an averages thing, and that might be worth digging down at a later time to the distinctions there.
I would agree with that, Roman, that that granular level of detail is something that you go through an exhaustive public outreach process. You get a lot more information behind a lot more data. You would want to understand the average lot size in relationship to the carrying capacity of a given lot, understand the infrastructure needs. There's a lot that goes into this that is not part of the scope of a master planning process.
And I don't disagree that the conversation should happen at all. I think it's worth.
Yeah, it's a really important conversation because ultimately when we're hearing things from the community and housing is rising to the top, we have all these other limiting factors. We don't have a lot of area. We don't want to sprawl out. We don't have a lot of environmental area to sprawl out. We want to be connected to transit and to our vital services. And so one of the options is to look at this type of future land use to consider how else we may integrate additional homes into Mount Crested Butte. And it's probably the most important conversation we'll have today.
Dwayne and then Dusty.
I'll back up.
Okay.
So assuming that the council adopts this and we start, moving forward through the planning commission, how does this get integrated into new future proposals? Or do the code changes need to come first?
Yes. So it's a two-step thing. So you would have a document that you could refer to in the decision-making process, since it would be an adopted document. So anything that was deemed complete, any application that were deemed complete after the adoption of this plan would be subject to this plan and not the 2007 master plan. So you'd be able to look at any application, bless you, through the lens of this master plan. And then, so with regards to implementation, that is a much larger conversation. So we have the goals, policies, and recommendations section of in each action plan area. So similar to when you went through the master planning process back in 2007, 2006, it outlines a number of recommendations. So what we need to do as town staff is provide a strategic plan. So think of it kind of like a capital improvement plan. So you have a 5-year capital improvement plan, but you also have we need to resurface the roads in next year, and we know that we need to do restriping every year. So we would take the various recommendations for implementation and start to identify when we want to phase those. The transportation demand management strategy does a good job of outlining kind of the low hanging fruit or easier things that we can just go ahead and we can probably do those without a huge lift from staff, but we need to consider our staff resources and then get direction from council as to what staff should focus on based on our community needs and then based on our resources and funding availability for a given fiscal year. So we're going through the budget process right now, and that implementation of this master plan will certainly be a component of that budgetary review process coming into the fall.
But for planning commission too, Dusty, what you would find with this kind of detailed goals and policies, any application that comes through, staff can come look through the plan, and so can planning commission, and say how that application meets master plan goals and policies. So you'd have a lot more teeth in terms of deciding if something is a good idea to be implemented or something is not. It comes back to Hillary's point about being proactive and saying what we want to happen where, and then having some guidance in our master plan that says, well, this is, you know, this does meet it, this doesn't meet it.
Thank you.
Any further discussion on the future land use map? Lisa.
Comment. So I took a class, actually 54 hours of classes to earn my Planning Institute of Colorado certificate.
Awesome.
Thank you. I learned a lot. One thing that they said was you never ever want to upzone. You want to work with what you have. We have a ton of multifamily, high and low density in this area. Why would I want to vote to have a single family home site turned into a triplex?
That's interesting direction because that's not common practice in planning currently. What we're seeing across many communities, many states across the country is actually a trend for upzoning and increasing density to address our housing issues, because what has created our issue is the lack of upzoning, is single family zoning, is essentially constraining those resources to not really accommodate the growth of any community. People are still having children, and as long as people have children, they will grow up to be adults that will need to live somewhere. And so the housing density should respond to our community's need in a responsible way where that growth should occur. So while I appreciate that you went through that course and I commend you for having done that, I would say that it's not practice today to limit zoning in that manner anymore.
Most jurisdictions to deal with affordability have actually, some have eliminated single family zoning.
And that's not what this plan
It
is
doesn't
also
do that.
suggesting.
Yeah,
Okay,
doesn't do that.
I concur
That's
with
too
you
far.
in some stuff of what you're saying, but in this class that I took, which is where I'm getting this from, it said you want to exhaust all other options of multifamily, high density, low density before you go and switch a single family residence to a triplex or a duplex. So why would I not explore, why would I not want those opportunities exhausted first? That's where the high density is located. I mean, we've got Marcelina, there's high density sites all along there. Why would I want to change something on Cinnamon Mountain Road or Interside Road? I mean, I'm thinking about the people around this particular lot that wants to say, hey, I want to put a duplex in there.
Frankly, I would say that we have exhausted our options. We've only had 2 community housing units built since 2010. We haven't had any real residential multifamily development that would require inclusionary zoning units. So to get those community housing units. So at this point, we're at a stasis and we're not really addressing our community need unless we take some bold action. And I would also argue that this isn't the only tool in our toolbox to address our housing issues. I don't want to make it sound like this will fix all of our problems, but we need to explore all of our problems because frankly, we have a responsibility to the community that responded and said that housing is their #1 priority to address that through the mechanisms that we have available to us. Fine.
What I'm not picking up on, which I wish I was that there's some consideration for the character of the neighborhood. And I think that Sarah started down this road and thinking that if we are just doing it just so we can increase density, so we can get out, in that density, some more affordable housing. At what expense are we accomplishing that? And by expense, how are we changing the character of a neighborhood? Like like you use the Cinnamon Mountain Road anthracite example, where it came up that, you say, well, okay, we need to increase density anywhere we can.
Didn't quite say that.
I'm reading into it. Thank you for reading.
No worries.
And I guess it's my reading into it that it seems like, from one of the comments that you made about, we've only had 2, community housing units developed since 2007, you said?
10.
10. So we're going to change the whole character of neighborhoods just to add how many community housing units? Once again, these part of my deliberations, like I try to factor in, well, what is the end result going to look like?
Sure.
And it's a weakness of my ability that I can't see anything good.
Well, may I? So 2 things, a few things actually, probably. So the first being the character of the neighborhood. If you don't have people living in a neighborhood, it has no character. And keeping people living in Mount Crested Butte is what will create character in a neighborhood. And we haven't got to the point where we're looking at each individual neighborhood and what's appropriate in those locations. The plan recommends examining areas for the potential for increased density. It's not prescriptive, and it doesn't necessarily say that thou shalt in this particular location. It doesn't rezone. There's a process that needs to go behind that, where each community in each neighborhood, and each community member actually is reached out to directly through the form of a mailer typically, to get their comment and feedback in that process. And so to your point about character of a neighborhood, I know some folks like to pick on it because the snow storage is somewhat lacking, but Pitchfork is a great example of a PUD that did create a community that does have a mixed inventory of housing, that has quadplexes, that has condos, that has single family, that has duplexes. It has a variety of housing types for a variety of housing needs. And I was a former resident of the Pitchfork community, and I actually felt like I knew all of my neighbors. I knew all of their dogs. And so allowing for different housing types is also part of this conversation. It doesn't necessarily mean that everything will turn into condos overnight, but just creating that diversity in housing stock will increase the ability for various people to live in your neighborhood on a permanent basis. Roman, I think you were raising your hand.
I don't contest any of that, but you've heard the axiom, different strokes for different folks.
Mm-hmm.
There are, just for example, on Cinnamon Mountain Road, I have people that live full-time around me. But everybody who lives around me doesn't have people who live full-time around them. So that is the character of a neighborhood that makes it desirable to me.
That's great that you have neighbors.
That there are some people there, but it's not, there's not dozens of cars passing by every day. So in this whole process, I'm just, I'm desirous to not throw the baby out with the bathwater. On a certain level, part of the challenge that I think that we're encompassing, or at least to my way of thinking, is that we haven't even really determined what's the holding capacity of the area. I mean, the carrying capacity of the area. Do we want to have 2,000 people living up here? And if we do have 2,000 people, which essentially is only doubling the size of the population, what's the quality of life going to be like when that happens? And, the conversations, and right now is the time to be having this conversation, to my way of thinking, because it is the plan for the future. And I'm concerned.
I appreciate that. Just in the interest of time, unless you have a
No,
direct
I'm sorry.
change. Okay, no, you're fine. I just want to make sure that everybody gets their comments in. And I saw that Roman had his hand raised, and I believe that Dusty had his hand raised, and I want to spend, nope, just Roman, or no. Okay, people are just stretching and getting fidgety, I suppose. It's going to be a long meeting.
Hello, this is Nancy.
Hi, Nancy. How are you?
Hi. As you said initially, we are a community of 70% second homeowners. And I didn't get the feeling from the community survey that we want to morph into a community that's more similar to Gunnison or Crested Butte South of 35% second homeowners and 60% residents. So I'm a little confused as to why we are really trying to change dramatically, unless we're going to say that up front in the master plan that we want to become more of a year-round resident. We really want to alter the number of second homeowners, and this is why we have this land use plan.
Sorry, Nancy. Go ahead.
Then the other concern is that when you put a land use plan like this, it's not just future zoning, it's also determining where short-term rentals are or not. I think that opens up that can of worms there. So we start designating, high density residential areas. Well, that's where all the short-term rentals should go. And then the mixed density, well, maybe we should have short-term rentals there, but we shouldn't have them in any of the low density areas. That's sort of a possibility that we would be faced down the future when we're looking potentially to address short-term rentals.
So I just want to be very clear that this is, again, not a regulatory document, and it's not providing any suggestion as to what STR regulations should be or even regulating them. There is a recommendation to look at STRs and how do we balance the needs of our community versus our short-term rentals, acknowledging the fact that we are a resort community, that we do have excise tax that benefits our housing fund. But we also have residents and businesses that we need to support with the land and housing that we do have. So I don't want to go too far down the STR rabbit hole. But I hear what you're saying, and I think I'm a little confused, and I just want to clarify something. In the introduction, I believe that might be what you're referring to in terms of the community vision statement rather than the survey, which I do feel reflects that we want to have a year-round community. I feel that not in my experience with outreach, just the tabling of the farmers market, it's not just people that live here, it's the visitors to our community that see the importance and the need for community housing to support our residents. And so that is the intent behind the recommendations of the future land use map.
I
so-
realize that, but we are, I mean, this is for our community. It's not for Crested Butte, it's not for Gunnison, it's for our community. And actually, if you look at the respondents in the survey from just the Mount Crested Butte people, their number one priority was not community housing. It was close, but their number one priority was downtown vibrancy, and then community housing, and then maintaining access to the outdoors and the environment. So, you know, I'm just sort of at a crossroads as who's this for? I mean, I thought this was a master plan for our community. And does our community want to change from 70% second homeowners to something that's more like Crested Butte? Then we need to say that in the master plan. That's what our goals are.
Thank you, Nancy. Roman.
I'm just viewing this as a component to the entire thing. We went from one extreme to a more balanced approach here. And before it was a base area, it seemed study. And that if that was the number one priority, I think the previous iteration indicated that it was the only priority. And this is a more balanced approach. And this is one slide in the entire document. So I'm curious about what the rest of the presentation would look
I
like.
appreciate that. And in the interest of time, and given that we have to wrap up at 5:50 to recalibrate the room, no pun intended, for the 6 o'clock. Unless we have any other closing thoughts, we will move on to housing, which is sure to not be a contentious issue. Anyone on the internet there? Okay. So I don't feel like I actually need to go too deep into this because land use is just so integrated with our housing needs, and so many of those recommendations are directly tied to that. But again, I think some of the things here that we didn't touch on in the land use section was investigating the town-owned lots for community housing, because again, going back to the fact that we have limited land, the town effectively has 3 lots that could be considered for community housing, and then just giving that direction to have a regional approach with regional partners to address what is very much a regional issue. I'm going to skip over this because that's land use related as well. So placemaking and vibrancy. This was, these slides aren't intentionally ordered in terms of priority. They're just ordered in the way the master plan was organized. So placemaking and vibrancy was an important goal identified by our community. And part of this, there's 2 parts to this, is not only the vibrancy of our base area, but we need to consider the vibrancy of our neighborhoods. And, you know, Dwayne gets to know and see all of his neighbors, and you know, the potential for as things redevelop, having pocket parks, places where community can meet. And then of course there's the base area. So in the base area, in the placemaking and vibrancy section, there are a number of recommendations that are short, mid, and long term. And some of those include enhancing our existing base area, because it isn't going to happen overnight, but there are small tactical urbanism things that we could potentially do or make room for more accurately in the base area and in our commercial core to allow for areas of interest using either lighting, certain streetscaping applications. If you've ever been to Boston, they have taken large swaths of intersections and consolidated their intersections down, created barriers, and then had artists paint murals, and then placing furniture and trees and planters and creating areas of interest where people can gather, and public art. And so we don't have streets necessarily that we have large areas that we could take over, but taking in consideration where we could do these in the base area to draw folks in and keep them there. One of the other recommendations is to identify a potential primary corridor for to serve as a pedestrian focused main street. We don't identify this in the plan. Again, this isn't a base area plan. It's just an outline of recommendations to look at as we move forward as a community. Another thing is looking at horizontal zoning. I touched on this briefly, but it might require some degree of explanation. So that effectively is restricting land uses based on the floors that they're on. So that first floor is so critical in a commercial environment to create that vitality, and having businesses that pull people in and that create pedestrian circulation and that have relationships to one another. So if this restaurant, you can't get in here for another hour, maybe we go down to this restaurant here. So having that synchronicity between those uses, and then uses that don't draw as much pedestrian activity are perhaps more appropriate on a second floor, such as an office or something to that effect. So we kind of started touching on this, but placemaking and vibrancy, in order to have those businesses, you have to have critical mass in order to support them. Right now, we could potentially support up to 100,000 square feet, but that's based on what we currently have. So if we keep more folks in the base area, and if we have that vibrancy, we could potentially support even more than what we're currently recommending. And so that goes to not only our visitor population, but our year-round residents.
When you talk about the 100,000 square feet, I mean, does that mean throughout the community or just in the base area?
So it was based in the commercial core.
Okay.
That would include the potentially.
It was
dirt
based in the
parking lot.
commercial core. I'm sorry?
The dirt parking lot.
The dirt parking lot is part of the commercial core is the DDA commercial core. We went with a boundary that was consistent. That way, when we're looking and analyzing things and applying policy, it's consistent and it's not confusing for staff, the DDA, or applicants as they're coming through a process. Anything on placemaking and vibrancy before I move on? Okay. So this is going to be a relatively soft touch on parks and open space because most of our open space surrounds us. We have one park, it's in our town hall's backyard here. So what we really want to focus on is how we address our parks issues regionally, how we can work with organizations like MetRec to identify maybe a North Valley Recreation Center. I think we'd all probably appreciate having a rec center in the north end of the valley. And then looking at potential code amendments to create meaningful open space. Right now, we have an open space requirement for PUDs, but it doesn't really have to do much of anything for the members of the community. It doesn't have to serve as a park or a gathering place. So let's take a look at how we require open space and what that needs to be. And then lastly, increasing pedestrian and bicycle connectivity to parks and open space just to allow for greater access and connectivity throughout not just the rec path, but to the rec path.
One of the examples I was going to touch on with placemaking and vibrancy, but it does also relate to pedestrian access and bicycle access. A really great example of tactical urbanism, low cost, easy entry is what has happened on the Yampa Street corridor along the river in downtown Steamboat. If you've been there, before they made all of the more expensive infrastructure improvements, they actually went in and partitioned off where the bicycle lane would be, where on-street parking would occur, and did all of this with just, rubber parking stops in order to really create and show people what that future streetscape could be like. They left it like that through a winter and a summer so that their public works operators could also try to operate within the framework of snow removal and things of that nature within that kind of new vision for how that street would function. And now they implemented it. And so there are a lot of different ways you can look at different opportunities to start to create these linkages without sinking a lot of money into capital improvements and things like that. But that really ties in the parks and open space recommendations with our vibrancy recommendations.
And it also ties into transportation. Thank you for that segue.
You're welcome.
Yeah.
Can I say for these last two, particularly the parks space and the placement, that's I'm very pleased in seeing that because sometimes we get focused on housing, and more housing for people who want to live here, that we forget about the people who live here already and what amenities and what things we should be providing for them, because they are our first responsibility, our constituents, our current owners, and we should be providing services to them rather than always just focusing on people who want to come in here. So I applaud you for those last couple.
Thank
things.
you. That actually, so there was a quote in the 2007 plan that we want to be a community, not a community of houses. And so that just kind of ties in nicely with how these documents evolved over time. So, thank you.
All right,
Yes.
so that some of these ideas, particularly the vibrancy, great ideas, but almost all of that land is privately owned.
Mhm.
So you make these grand decisions, but the private property owner has their own property rights. How do you?
So let
Don't
me.
confuse us with details.
No, it's actually, this is
Thanks,
something
Jerry.
I'm happy to explain. So land use is driven by zoning code and design guidelines. So design guidelines help shape redevelopment in a given community. So no, I can't say you're going to redevelop your building right now, but what our community could do through amendments of the code is create provisions within that code for certain pedestrian amenity space, for certain design standards that require that there is a certain amount of outdoor seating, or things that create more vibrancy or pedestrian scale, that create an attractive place in the redevelopment of a given area. It could also potentially direct mixed use development. So allow mixed use development by right, which is something that this community has desired since 2007. So you have a certain ratio of, say, lodging to commercial uses, or you have a ratio of mixed use building where you have commercial on the bottom and maybe some residential upstairs. So well, yes, we have a lot of private land in the base area. We can create zoning code that results in design guidelines like the DDA has that direct development in the shape and vision of our community.
So it'd be new construction, new development.
Oh, yeah. Yeah. It's not like we're going to go say, like, march up somebody and be like, you need to redevelop your home now.
Like if somebody
That's
comes
not
in
what we do.
with a proposal, we can point to the master plan and say, these are the things that the community wants to see and has wanted to see for a long time.
Does that help clarify?
Until somebody decides to develop something, nothing changes.
Correct.
Essentially, yeah.
But at least when they do, we have a plan in place that guides what we want versus what they want, and us just fighting on a whim that's fits or not.
Well, actually, quite a bit of stuff would have to change prior to that, because we would have to codify some of the ideas within this master plan before the developer came to the table.
Aspects, yes. We could refer, like as Elena had mentioned, we could point back to the recommendations and use that as a policy document, but are they necessarily standards or criteria? It wouldn't be at that point, but part of a master plan and implementation of a plan generally is taking a look at your land use code and seeing how it does or does not meet the goals of the community, and then going through some sort of amendment process.
Right.
And I will also add that there's a lot of the base area that's in a PUD, which kind of goes to speak to the fact that the zoning might not be working there. We could have a larger conversation about that, but I will just shortly say that if one person wants to redevelop their lot, they have to pull everybody into the process. And so creating a little bit more, I wouldn't say flexibility, but the ability to just move through a process rather than having to go through the cumbersome process of a PUD alteration might actually result in more desirable outcomes and faster redevelopment within the base area.
Well, most of that is zone PUD, if not all of it. Most of it also has no entitlements at this point.
again, that's it. I don't want to get too far in the weeds.
It's okay. I'm just saying that it's a blank slate
That's where
already.
zoning would really help address, and having underlying zoning in some of those areas that are just PUD would be helpful. So if a PUD expires, that at least somebody knows what they can do with that particular lot of land, and that the community understands what could be done with that lot of land through some sort of rezoning process.
Agreed.
In two different communities that I've worked with in the mountains over the past 6 years, two of them now, by stating their goals for vibrancy, for activation, for creation of a, a more active commercial area. Two of them most recently did have private landowners that come, I saw your plan, I'm really excited about it, I want to do it. Like it's quite possible that can happen.
Okay.
But I am an optimist. But I've also seen it happen in mountain communities that I've been working in very, recently. It's getting the community's vision out there on paper and saying this is what we want to see. And then people take notice of the public sector going ahead and being proactive and saying, we do want to have some of these things. It shows that you're open for that.
Roman, thank you.
I guess the way I've been interpreting this, and maybe to address your inquiry and yours, Dusty, is that this is again more of a tool. So if an area is identified as being a good spot for a placemaking area and somebody was going to develop it, they might say, well, based on this document, community values, what placemaking is, it might be in my best interest to incorporate that into my design because it might help my mixed use development succeed.
Right.
That's a good point. Thank you, Roman. Anyone else before we move on to, we just got a couple more and then if we can open up to a larger conversation. Anybody on there? Nancy, you're off mute, but I don't know if you have something to share. No? Okay, thank you. Okay, where were we? Transportation. So transportation and land use are one of those intertwined things, particularly with regard to, as mentioned in the land use section, in that having that critical, you have to have people to get on buses in order to have frequency that is desired within our community to make our bus systems really work well. So that's part of what will help create more ridership, which will then in turn help with some of our other goals, such as climate goals. And then we also want to, Troy had mentioned this during his presentation, the regional component. We've been working with the town of Crested Butte. We actually meet with them every single month to discuss regional ideas and potential implementation steps to address some of these issues. We cannot control the four-way, but we definitely can influence the four-way in how much traffic we bring to the mountain during Christmas week, for example. So working with our regional partners is going to be a really important part of implementing our transportation demand strategy, which outlines those short, mid, and long-term goals to help address traffic. So whether that's an intercept lot, which is a really big project, to maybe we have a regional e-bike share to allow people to get up and down the rec path a little bit faster than they can right now to help with that multimodal connection for commuters getting to and from either town. So we'd also like to promote some more efficiency within parking. The commercial core is a great example of this. We have a lot of surface parking on a lot of valuable real estate, and that's not really the highest and best use of that area. In order to activate that space, we might need to consider consolidation of parking facilities. So we develop more of a park once and then walk around, and you create that vitality through not having people driving from point A to B to C. And whether that's at an intercept lot, an unidentified spot at this time, or consolidated parking facilities on the mountain, it's about getting people out of their cars and using either their feet, bicycle, or bus to get from point A to point B. And this ties into, again, the placemaking and vibrancy component. If you have more foot traffic, you have more people potentially buying things. Just stand on Elk Avenue on any Saturday in summer, and there are people in and out of every single shop that's on that street. So having that pedestrian critical mass is going to be really important to creating that vibrancy. It also ties into land use. So the more sprawled out we get, the more car dependent we are. So if we have consolidated, compact, walkable neighborhoods, we'll actually see less traffic, because rather than getting into your car to go run an errand, you'll just hop on your bike or you'll walk to a neighborhood grocery store, which is one of the things that was identified as one of those essential services that folks would like to see. Anything on transportation? We do, I'll add that we do have the transportation demand management strategy. I did not include that as part of our presentation because we would be here until probably 10 o'clock. But that is available online, and we will be touching on that at some point in the future. It's just, there was a lot to get through today, but the recommendations that are interwoven into the master plan are more what we can do within our community, and that transportation demand management strategy talks about what we can do with our regional partners. So, anybody has any thoughts on the transportation recommendations section?
All right.
Yes, Gary.
One of the comments in there was more paid parking. Just mentioned that the Rasta lot, I guess we just can't get rid of that name. But it was designed to, it could be paid parking real easy. If the council decided to do that with a minimal cost. You could put, you know, those boxes, you put your money in and make that paid parking, which would force some people to ride the bus more now, and you could accumulate those funds for whatever the council decided to do. And that'd be a short-term thing, could be done relatively easy.
And that should be noted that that is a recommendation in the transportation demand management strategy. So thank you for adding that. And that part of like the whole strategic plan will include prioritization of various action items.
Say tactically, it could then be done in short term.
Thank you. Anyone else? Great. I've been told that I have 10 minutes, so. Fortunately, we only have 2 more action items to get through. So quality of life, this is really just kind of brings everything full circle in terms of land use, transportation, parks and open space, and I am drawing a blank on all of the other things. I should just flip the page here. Water usage, housing, infrastructure, everything ties into quality of life. Access to the outdoors, access to housing, access to essential services. Access to safe transportation, all really speak to kind of that basic, we were saying Maslow's hierarchy of needs, like what is that foundational need that we have as individuals? And so that really speaks to our quality of life. And so unless we can address our basic needs like housing, so shelter, food, water, we really can't go above and beyond that. So on top of looking at our essential services and on top of looking at housing, we want to have complete neighborhoods that serve not only future community, but the community that exists today. We want to retain our open spaces, but we want to make those accessible for everyone. Like we want to make housing accessible for members of our community rather than driving them out. We want to adopt policies that promote air quality, like reducing our transportation or single vehicle car trips, water conservation such as, and we'll get into this in a moment, reducing outdoor watering needs. And then different types of commercial in different places. So there are a lot of resort focused commercials such as ski shops and ski rentals and restaurants and other sorts of t-shirt shops and that sort of thing that are appropriate in a resort area, but it might not be appropriate to say have a neighborhood coffee shop or your dog groomer because you don't want to take your dog down in the chaos at Christmas into the base area to get him groomed. So, you know, just thinking about the balance of what makes complete neighborhoods and what makes a complete community. I feel like I've touched on every single point of intersectionality here. So water, I think what's important, I'm sorry, I skipped over asking y'all if you wanted to talk further about quality of life to get through this. Did you have something, Gary?
No.
Okay, great. Did anybody have anything on quality of life?
I was gonna maybe save it to the end, but since it fits here, just some things I've heard this meeting is sort of making sure we take care of people who live here already. And so just want to have that be something we always come back and touch base on as we're considering all of those things. And it seems like, you know, maybe there's a little bit of a disconnect for quality of life for people who are here now, maybe those who aspire to be here. And so again, just trying to keep the quality of life that we have for residents already as a front of the mind thing. That's all.
Thank you. Roman.
I hear both what Michael's saying and what Nicholas is saying, but I wonder if we can maybe go back in time a little bit to also include the people that have been displaced because of the change in the housing mix here. And if 10% of that number, that's, let's say 10 years ago, that number was 60% in the short-term rental pool or what have you, then what about the 10% of people that have been bounced? And at what point do we start to include some of those into trying to come back?
Yep.
There.
On that same subject, just to further complicate things, what about the people that visit here? That love Crested Butte and they come for our amenities. So I don't want to lose that either.
Are you speaking second homeowners?
Our tourists. We're a tourist economy, so we can't eliminate everything that makes us attractive to the people that fuel the economy.
Totally agree. Yeah.
So solve it all, Hillary.
And I guess that's, you know, you mentioned hierarchy of needs, and I could see those groups having a different hierarchy.
Definitely.
And that kind of goes back to talking about STRs, for example, and acknowledging the fact that there are benefits to STRs. I stay in STRs, and I'm sure everybody in this room has stayed in one, and that they do bring value to resort communities like ours, and that they're an important part in that they serve part of our lodging bed base. And then you also, as Roman had mentioned, there are people that have been displaced by them. And it's about finding that balance between the two. And that is not what this document intends to do, because that is a much deeper technical conversation that we don't have the data right now to fully delve into, but it's definitely one worth having. It's like, how do we support the different needs of everyone in our community? When I say community, we're not just talking about the people that do live here full-time. We are talking about our part-time residents, and we were talking about our visitors, because it really is those three pieces of the pie that make our whole community.
The plan as a whole really does touch on all of that. And I think Roman brought that up, just that now it's a lot more well-rounded and totally acknowledging like who we are, and we are a tourist destination, but that we also need people to work in all those places, and all of it needs to come together.
Any more on quality of life? Because I have 2 minutes left. Okay. Just going to really briefly touch on water, because we have the Mount Crested Butte Water and Sanitation District, and as such, they control our water. We have completed a technical analysis and a number of recommendations that are based on best management policies from, I'm not going to remember the name, but the Gunnison Basin Management Task Force or something to that effect, but had outlined a number of recommendations that have been pulled into the recommendations matrix in order to promote more water conservation, creating that culture of conservation, reducing runoff into our waterways, and then having water conservation measures for not only our residents, but also for our businesses, and trying to encourage our guests to use a little less water when they stay here.
Those policies are in review with the district right now. And so we
Yes.
just have the intro included in the plan because it's important for them to weigh in on all of those. So
And I would add the district is undergoing essentially a new survey of all its water resources, and that is not completed yet, but it's in the pipe, pun intended.
Thank you for that pun. I love a good pun. With that, unless anybody has any comments further, I will go into the next steps. I do want to note that I am available to not only everybody not everybody at this table, but everybody that joined us online. Thank you. And those of y'all in the audience, if you have any comments at all on the master plan, we are accepting comment up until September 23rd. We have created a Google form to not only prompt conversation, but to collate all these comments into one spot and make it easy to submit your comments. And we'll be going into a comment resolution and hopefully a final draft here in December of 2022. This will not be the last time that y'all see me between now and then discussing the master plan, I am sure. So I don't want you to think that this is your last opportunity to say something with regard to the plan. And with that, thank you. I appreciate all the time that it took for, I know that these are long work sessions, sit here for 2 hours and go to regular meeting is a lot of your day. So just appreciate y'all taking the time and the thoughtfulness that it takes to make comments and provide direction on the shape of your community. It's really, really important part of the process, and I just greatly appreciate it. So thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you.